All right, lesson number 5, configuring client access. In an earlier lesson, we learned all about the different ways clients can connect to a network, all the different types of wireless LAN security that's available, and that's when we got into all the extensible authentication discussions and open authentication and so on. But when you build your wireless LANs using local remote authentication methods, you have to decide what method you want to use. So what we're going to talk about in this lesson is how do we configure open authentication? We already talked about the concept of open authentication. How do we configure pre-shared key authentication? We'll take a look at how to configure extensible authentication in Radius. And then finally, we'll take a look at web authentication, or what we call WebAuth, and identify its use and the configuration steps that are required for that process to take place. Perhaps the easiest one to configure is open authentication. Open authentication operates just at layer 1 and layer 2. It implies that you have some type of security, but security is not really technically required, right? You just want people to be able to connect to the wireless network. So go to the General tab. This is all done, by the way, under the configuration of the wireless LAN. As you can see right here, we're in Pod 1 Open. You go to the General tab. The status has to be enabled for the wireless LAN and for it to be used, so that checkbox has to be turned on. Broadcast SSID should be enabled, particularly for open authentication, because you're assuming that these might be guest users or something to that effect. And then you have to specify the management interface group on that wireless LAN so that the VLAN can be assigned to that particular, for that client access. Then under the security tab, you just simply specify no security. All right, for both the layer 2 and the layer 3 security tabs, you specify no security. That's pretty much it. None of those previous things I just mentioned had really anything to do with the actual authentication piece, but all prerequisites in order for the wireless LAN to function properly. Pre-shared key authentication uses a common key between the client and the access point for authentication and encryption. So you're going to provide a base layer of security for small networks. Static key, make sure the key is somewhat secure in that it has the appropriate length and variation, but the keys have to be deployed on the clients that use that particular wireless LAN. All right, so if you don't want those clients that know the key to be able to use that wireless LAN in the future, unfortunately, your only recourse is to go ahead and change the key, which then means you now have to configure the key on the other clients that are still connecting. So go to the wireless LAN again. Same concept. You're going to set up the profile, set up the status, or enable the status of the wireless LAN, identify which radios and what interface group it's tied to. All right, but under the layer 2 security tab, you're going to select WPA plus WPA2 for layer 2 security. Now, if you're choosing to use WPA2, AES should be used to provide encryption as well. So you'll notice there that there's a checkbox, WPA2 policy AES, that's not checked by default. You should check that box. All right, the authentication key management will still be pre-shared key. We're not using infrastructure, we're not using AAA, so we are still going to use a pre-shared key. We see that listed in the pre-shared key format. We can do 802.1x, we can do CCKM, we can do 802.1x or FTP pre-shared key, but we're just going to enable the pre-shared key. That pre-shared key can be entered as a ASCII character or as a hexadecimal character. If you're entering it as a ASCII character, you have to have at least 8 characters for the password. If you're doing hex, you have to have at least 64 characters for hex. All right? To effectively protect against brute force attacks and dictionary attacks, make sure the key is adequately secure. For the configuration of the wireless client with the pre-shared key, all the clients just have to know what that pre-shared key is, or they have to have a profile defined in their wireless client when they connect to the network. All right. The next option that you have is to run extensible authentication with a local configuration. So this is going to provide for 802.1x authentication, but it does require a supplicant, an authenticator, and an authentication server. Now the wireless controller and the AP will be the authenticator, and the wireless controller in this particular mode of operation will also act as the authentication server. The supplicant's going to be the wireless client with the appropriate credentials. So when we configure local EAP, 802.1x authentication, this means we no longer want clients to have access to the wireless LAN, or if we no longer want clients to have access to the wireless LAN, we simply have to revoke the credentials. We don't have to change the configuration of the wireless LAN itself. By the way, all those credentials are locally created and stored on the controller. You can see under the local EAP profiles, here's your profile, and then you create the credentials under the local net users configuration. That's under AAA local net users, and you can specify the profile that it's applied to. So you want to create the profile first, set up that configuration profile, then go and create the users. All right, you can create the user with a username and a password, and we can restrict the credentials based on specific wireless LANs that they're connected to, or we could say this is going to apply to any wireless LAN. That's based on the profile, by the way. Under the security local EAP profiles option, you create the profile. It's going to have a name. Select the EAP types that are used. The options that you have, checkboxes there, LEAP, EAP-FAST, EAP-TLS, and PEEP. We talked about all of those 4 options and what the difference was between each one of those. And then that profile gets associated to the wireless LAN. That's so that the wireless LAN knows which EAP types are available for usage within that wireless network. So you could select more than one, all right? Now, if I go to the security tab, did my slide switch here? Yes. If I go to the security tab, this is where I can specify all my layer 2 security uses with WPA2, my policy AES, my authentication key management of 802.1x, and so on. I can also specify my AAA servers, but in this particular case, because this is local EAP authentication, we're not going to use any AAA servers, but we're going to choose the local authentication using the local EAP profile that we had previously configured. That's this one here. So we're not specifying our LDAP servers, we're just specifying our EAP profile that we previously configured. What do I do on the client side? The clients have to have a profile that's configured for the type of EAP that they're using, and the client has to provide the appropriate username and password to access the network using 802.1x, whether it's the native supplicant inside Windows or Mac OS, or whether it's like AnyConnect or some other supplicant. Okay. Now, what if I want to use external AAA? So now I want to integrate the use of a radius server and apply still this 802.1x complement. So EAP also does use 802.1x, but in this particular case, all of the credentials are stored separately on an authentication server. That's going to scale much better for larger deployments when you have potentially hundreds or thousands of users. So you want to have that centralized management and maintenance of those local users, where doing that on a controller is not really very practical. So what you're looking at in this particular screen, and by the way, it doesn't have to be ICE, but what you're looking at on this particular screen is the use of ICE to provide that functionality. Okay, so under ICE, you go into administration, you go to identity management, right here, administration, highlighted here, identity management, and then go to identities right here, and then you can see users. It's covered up here, but you would see on the left panel here a list of all the users, and you can click on those users to see the user properties, all the credentials, and so on. Then you go to administration, network resources, this button here, and network devices, and you can add the device. The authentication server has to be aware of the controller, obviously, or have some way of verifying that the controller is authorized to request authentication information from ICE. So you do need to have that in there. The name of the controller, the management IP address, and the mask are what we configure. Those are required fields. And then you have a shared secret password that's used to trust the controller to pass data back and forth between ICE and the controller. Okay? Now, on the controller, conversely, I have to go under AAA, I go under Radius, I go into Authentication. I specify the remote Radius ID that's defined in the controller. The ICE IP address is defined as the same shared secret password. We define the ICE IP address, and then the shared secret password we put here is the same thing that we would have already configured in ICE to allow this controller to communicate to ICE. Then we go into the security tab. Still, we're going to select layer 2 security, uses WPA2 with policy AES and authentication key management of 802.1x in this case, not PreShared Key. And then we specify that external servers will be enabled, and we can go in and configure those external servers. By default, the controller chooses the order of the Radius servers by their server index number. You can see that, or you can manually choose them under the list of authentication servers there. All right. On the client side, you have to have a profile, of course, EAP, and the client has to provide a username and password. So from the client's perspective, it looks identical. Client doesn't know if they're doing local authentication or if you're doing AAA authentication. Same process. Guest users, well, they're going to need access to the internet, right? Come on. So we may want to have some way to authenticate them, or have some way, even if we don't authenticate them, for them to agree to an acceptable use policy. So web auth authentication, which can require credentials, so you can force authentication, or you can simply allow the users to acknowledge an AUP. That's the pass-through option, by the way. If you select authentication here, that's where you're going to require the credentials. If you select the pass-through option, you're not going to require the user to authenticate, but there will be an option for them to select that they approve of the acceptable use policy. All of the local web auth security is going to be at layer 3. It's going to be routed. It's not going to be switched. So go to the security tab. Layer 2, we don't specify any security for web auth. Layer 3 will be web policy security. Pass-through requires that only a client, like I said, acknowledges the AUP. There are other web policy methods when you select that drop-down. Authentication would require a username and password. That can be done through local EAP or remote using a Radius server, what we previously talked about. So what do we need for WebAuth? We need to know the WebAuth SSID. And after we connect to the wireless LAN, we have to open up a browser, enter the destination. The client acknowledges the AUP, maybe puts in some credentials, depending on how you have it configured, and they move forward. All right. So just kind of peeling back the layers, right? We're taking a look at each piece by piece, identifying all of the functionality that's important for this wireless LAN controller. So we talked about open authentication. There's no layer 2 security, WPA PreShared Key, PSK authentication implemented at layer 2, not layer 3. We talked about local EAP and what local EAP provides. AAA functionality without the use of an external AAA server. Then we talked about EAP with Radius, how we can use ICE to establish those policies and authentication. We didn't get into a whole lot of details on configuring the actual client component, right? Setting up the users and configuring policies for the users. But we did look at essentially the two areas where you have to configure ICE for this functionality. Finally, we wrapped up by talking about web auth authentication. That's implemented at layer 3. So we select no authentication for layer 2, and then we can have pass-through for an AUP without authentication, or we can do user authentication. By the way, I didn't mention this. If you are using user authentication, there's still an option to have them select that they verified the acceptable use policy. It's not that you have an option of one or the other. In every case, you want an AUP to be acknowledged, so that's available in both options. All right, so that concludes that lesson. Our next lesson, we're going to get into roaming, right? What's a mobility group? How do we handle dynamic layer 2 roaming? How do we handle dynamic layer 3 roaming? And we're going to describe the roaming concepts. All right,